Hi, I'm Dr. Larry Kavanagh, and thanks for joining in on this video. If you saw my previous video, which was about the Gospel of St. Matthew and the way it began with a genealogy of Jesus, and Matthew amazingly tracing back 42 generations of Jesus' ancestry. And in those 42 generations, Matthew mentions 40 men, great-great-great-great-great-grandparents of Jesus, and 5 women. 5 seems like a very small number, but for something written at the time, that's actually a pretty large number. And we talked about them. In looking over the Old Testament, however, in the men that Matthew mentioned, if you check out their wives and or their concubines and their mothers, you would find some additional names of women. In fact, I found 14 more women named that were not mentioned by Matthew that would be bona fide ancestors of Jesus, great-great-great-great-grandmothers. And of those 14, 7 had decent biographies that we could talk about that are in the Old Testament. So in the interest of full disclosure, let's talk about these 7 women, direct ancestors of Jesus, great-great-great-grandmothers. One of them is Jesus is a nephew of, but she's too important to leave out. So there's 7 of them that we're going to talk about the stories of. And they're pretty fascinating. And they tell a tale of good people and bad people, basically people, of whom Jesus descended, or the human Jesus descended. So let's talk about them. Matthew's gospel begins with, his genealogy begins with Abraham. So let's start there. Abraham's wife was Sarah. Now, you kind of have to look at the family tree of Abraham to see that Abraham was a son of a person named Terah, and Sarah was also a daughter of this Terah. It was a daughter of this Terah. They had different mothers, however. So that made Sarah, in addition to being Abraham's wife, also his half-sister. This figured importantly in the story of Abraham and Sarah. And the other thing to know is that one of the other children of Terah, namely Abraham's father, had a grandson named Lot. And this was the same Lot who got into trouble with Sodom and Gomorrah, but that's another story. This Lot did follow Abraham for part of his tribal existence, however, so that Lot and Abraham had some closeness connected with them. Well, let's get back to Sarah. So Abraham married Sarah, and Sarah must have been a very beautiful woman. I say this because there was a time when Abraham took his tribe into Egypt. They needed food, and Abraham met with the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh saw Sarah and said, wow, what a beautiful woman that was. And Abraham introduced Sarah as his sister, not as his wife. So since the Pharaoh heard that Sarah was Abraham's sister, the Pharaoh said, I want to take her as a wife. And Abraham said, be my guest, go right ahead. So the Pharaoh took Sarah, and Sarah lived for a time as one of the wives of the Pharaoh, until the Pharaoh found out about this, and the Pharaoh was very disturbed. The Pharaoh didn't worship the Hebrew God Yahweh, but he did worship his own gods. And for them, one does not marry another man's wife. So the Pharaoh was very displeased, called Abraham into his company and said, Abraham, take some gold, take some cattle, get out, and take your wife with you. So Sarah smilingly left Egypt as a richer man. A little trickery on the part of Abraham and Sarah. You'd say that Abraham told a lie, but it's only a half lie, because after all, Sarah was his half sister. So let's get back to the land of the Hebrews, of Abraham. Wasn't Canaan yet. And Sarah really wanted to have an heir, but she was barren. She simply could not bear children. And she felt bad for her husband Abraham because he needed to have an heir. In a spirit of generosity, Sarah told Abraham, "Here, you can have my servant, my slave girl, Hagar. Sleep with her, have a child by her, and that child will be your child." And Abraham did this because back in those days, you really needed to have an heir. And the rules for kinship were a little bit looser in those days. So if Abraham said that this child that he had by Hagar was his child and his heir, so be it. That's the way it would be. So Abraham did sleep with Sarah, with Hagar, and they did have a child, and the child was Ishmael. You've heard that name before. Maybe you read Moby Dick that begins, "I call me Ishmael." So Ishmael was taken by Abraham as his child, as his son. And Abraham truly did love Ishmael and played with him. And the story is, got along just fine with Ishmael and was perfectly ready to take Ishmael on as his bona fide heir. Well, time passed. Sarah got older. Abraham got older. Sarah was still barren, but they prayed a lot. And God looked and God smiled on them a lot. God told Abraham, Sarah's going to conceive. Abraham told Sarah, "You're going to conceive because God told me you would." Sarah didn't believe him. There's the story in the Old Testament about the three travelers that visited Abraham, and there were actually three angels, three messengers from God to tell Abraham that Sarah would be having a child within the next year. And what do you know? In her old age, Sarah did have a child. And this child was Isaac. So now Abraham had two children, one Ishmael, whom he loved dearly, and had taken on as his son, but was not his child by his bona fide wife. And he had Isaac, whom he also loved, who was the child of Sarah, his real wife. And Abraham would have let this situation persist, but Sarah wasn't willing to let this situation persist. Sarah told Abraham, "Well, Isaac is your real child, you know, and you're just going to have to get rid of this Ishmael. Send Ishmael and send Hagar away. Send her packing." And this was very hard. However, Abraham realized it was the right thing to do. And so Abraham cast Hagar and Ishmael out of the tribe, sent them off to the desert, where one would presume they would die without water, without food. And it was a heartbreaking scene. But it was important to Sarah, because Sarah says you can only have one wife and you can only have one heir, and Isaac is going to be your heir. You have to disown Ishmael. So there's the story. Abraham sends Hagar and Ishmael packing into the desert, and they leave. And you might think they're going to die, but not so, because there's another story in the Old Testament where God tells Ishmael, "You're also going to have very many children to form their own tribes. You're going to have your own tribe of 12 more children." And there's a story about an angel rescuing Hagar and Ishmael in the desert. However, they're forever separated from the Hebrew people at this time. They're their own. Ishmael and his tribe of Ishmael become what, for all practical purposes, are our current day Muslims. So let's get back to Abraham and Sarah. Now they have this child, Isaac. And of course, you remember the story of how God tested Abraham, said that he needed to take Isaac up to the hill to have a sacrifice to him, where the sacrificial offering was going to be your son, Isaac. And that Abraham was obedient to Yahweh in this, sent Isaac with him. And in the end, when the moment came where Abraham was ready to stab Isaac, there suddenly appeared an animal that he could slaughter, and Isaac was saved. Isaac and Abraham returned back to Sarah, and the happy family was restored. And Isaac was then the designated heir of Abraham. And Sarah played into this picture quite a bit. So Sarah was the first person we wanted to talk about, unfortunately not mentioned by Matthew. Let's move on to the next. And we'll keep in the same family and just take it to the next generation. Isaac. What happened with Isaac? As he grew up, he had taken over the tribe of his father Abraham, and he waited until he was relatively old, in at least his 40s, before he was ready to marry. So Isaac needed to have a wife, and Abraham wanted to make sure he got a wife. So Abraham sent a servant over to see his brother Nahor, who was running another tribe. Abraham said to the servant, go find Nahor with these offerings, because I understand that Nahor has some children, and I think he might have a daughter that might be suitable for my son Isaac. The servant went, and he went to a well and to get water, and this beautiful woman comes out to the well and offers to give water to this traveler. She didn't know exactly who he was, and refresh the traveler. Well, the traveler was so impressed with this beautiful girl who had been so kindly and so conscious of his thirst that he had given her, that she had given him some water. And he said, oh, you're pretty good. Who are you? Well, it turned out she was a daughter of Nahor. What do you know? Just who he was looking for. And her name was Rebecca. So the servant said, you're the one. I think you would be a wonderful wife for my boss's son, Isaac. And he did. And it turned out that Isaac thought so too. Isaac fell in love with Rebecca, and Isaac married Rebecca. So you have the story of Rebecca, who acquires Isaac as a husband because she was kind enough to give water to Abraham's servant, who was searching for a wife for Isaac. And it turns out, of course, that she's the daughter of Nahor, and Nahor is Abraham's brother. So you can get the picture here that Isaac and Rebecca are first cousins, and they are. This is not so unusual in Old Testament times that close relatives marry. I mean, after all, Abraham married Sarah, who was his half sister. Now we've got Isaac marrying Rebecca, who's his first cousin, I believe. And this is not unusual. You know, there really weren't that many people in those days. There were, and they were scattered. So the caution about not marrying too closely was not observed very well back in those days. But we'll pass on that. At any rate, so Isaac married Rebecca, and Rebecca becomes the second person that Matthew didn't speak about. One more thing I need to say about Isaac and Rebecca. Isaac, as the son of Abraham, there's a saying that we use, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Turns out that in part of their early days of married life, Isaac and his tribe had a famine, and they needed to visit the neighboring king, Abimelech. And when they visited Abimelech, they needed to get food from Abimelech. And does this sound familiar? Isaac introduced Rebecca as his sister. And Abimelech bought the story. And Abimelech said, she's very beautiful. I want to take her into my harem. And he did. And after a certain amount of time, Abimelech discovered that Rebekah was not Isaac's sister, but his wife. And Abimelech, although he didn't have the God of the Hebrews, Yahweh, his God also said, you just don't marry another man's wife. So Abimelech, being very upright and forthcoming, went to visit Isaac. Said, look, I gave you food. I took this woman in good faith, thinking she was available, and it turns out she's not. Take her back, take some food, take some gold as a gift, and please leave, because he was very embarrassed. So history repeated itself. The story of Isaac and Rebekah parallels the story of Abraham and Sarah, and so it goes. There's a lot of similarities between Rebekah and Sarah. Rebekah also was having trouble having children, and it wasn't until very late in life that Rebekah wound up having a child. And it was a vision that Rebekah had, that you will have a child. So Rebekah did become pregnant. Rebekah did have a child, and actually Rebekah had twins. There's a cute little story in the Old Testament talking about how the twins, even in the womb, were fighting with each other. At any rate, when the time came for Rebekah to give birth, the first twin that came out was a red-haired twin, and so they called him Esau, which means red hair. And then it said that the second twin came out holding on to the leg of the first twin, Esau, and this second twin was Jacob. So Jacob, by a few minutes delay, was not the firstborn son of Isaac. And as the kids grew up, Isaac actually preferred Esau. Esau was a sportsman. He liked to hunt, and that suited Isaac real well. Isaac enjoyed kids that liked to hunt and play and do stuff like that, whereas Jacob was loved by his mother. Jacob was more of a mama's boy. Well, Jacob was also a lot smarter than Esau, apparently. One of the stories in the Old Testament is that Esau came in from a hunt one day and saw that Jacob had something cooking on the stove. And Esau said, I'm hungry, will you feed me? And Jacob said, yeah, sure, but if you give up your right of first inheritance for one meal. Yeah. Well, it turns out Esau said, yeah, I'm very hungry. I don't care about the inheritance. You can have it. So Esau actually gave away his inheritance to Jacob for the sake of a meal. And believe me, it's in the Bible. Well, there's another story. Of course, this just because Esau tells Jacob that you can have my inheritance, that doesn't mean that Father Isaac has given it away. There's more to the story. That says that when Isaac was very old and growing blind, actually blind and couldn't see, Rebekah helped Jacob play a trick on Daddy Isaac. They sent Esau away to go hunting for meal, so Esau wasn't around. And Jacob put on a sheepskin, apparently, so that and if you were rubbing him, if you couldn't see him, and you rubbed his hairy chest, it would feel like a hairy chest, because it would be lamb's wool. It would feel like a hairy chest. And so Jacob went in to see his blind father Isaac with this hairy chest of a lambskin, and he told Isaac. Isaac said, "Who is it?" He said, "I'm Esau." And Isaac said, "Let me make sure you're not Jacob. Let me rub your chest." So he rubs his chest and he feels the wool, and he said, "Oh yeah, okay, you're Esau, right?" And so Jacob said, "Father, will you give me your blessing, and will you give me your inheritance?" Isaac said, "Sure, you're the one I wanted to give it to." And Isaac, thinking he was giving an inheritance to Esau, gave an inheritance to Jacob. So just like that, Jacob became the next leader of the tribe. So how about that? Now, with Jacob, I want to say before he married, before he found a bride, while he was growing up, he had a vision, a dream. And in his dream, he saw a ladder coming down from heaven. And this ladder coming down from heaven, there were saints and messengers from God going up and down between heaven and earth, carrying messages, carrying blessings. And it was a beautiful vision, and we called it Jacob's Ladder. And just for a little modern day relief, if you will, the story of Jacob and the dream of the ladder still is with us, even in the world of kids' toys and in the world of physics. There's a child's toy called the Jacob's Ladder. I'm going to show you a picture of it. And there's a thing in physics called a spark ladder, but which also is known as a Jacob's Ladder. You might have seen it in a Frankenstein movie. I'm going to show you a picture of it, the instrument that we use in physics, and also a gigantic accidental Jacob's Ladder caused by a power station that shorted out in a dramatic fashion. At any rate, that was just a little deviation. But let's think about how Jacob got a wife. And this will bring us to the next woman that Matthew didn't mention. Jacob found someone that he loved. She was a daughter of Laban, and Laban, by the way, was a brother to Rebekah. So that means that Rachel was a first cousin to Jacob. So, but he loved her. So Jacob went over to Laban, who was Rachel's father, and said, "I want to marry your daughter Rachel." Laban said, "Sure, but you'll have to work for me for 7 years and then I'll give her away." Jacob said, "Okay, I'll work for you for 7 years just so I can have Rachel." And Jacob worked for Laban for 7 years. And at the end of 7 years, he approached Laban and said, "Okay, my 7 years are up. I'm ready to take Rachel as my bride." Laban rubs his chin, thinks about it, not in Jacob's presence. And Laban is thinking of a different little problem here. Laban is realizing he's actually got 2 daughters. Rachel is actually his younger daughter. That's the one that Jacob loves. But his older daughter, whose name is Leah, the older daughter, nobody's asked to marry Leah. And Laban is very uncomfortable about this because you're supposed to marry children in the order in which they come. And Leah, being the oldest daughter, really should be the next in line. So Laban plays a trick. Laban sets up a wedding where the bride walks down the altar covered in a veil. Jacob takes the bride, and it turns out when she raises the veil, what do you know? It's Leah. So Jacob has pledged his love, has married Leah. What happened to Rachel? So you know what? Jacob just goes storming up and down. "You tricked me. You tricked me. That's not the one I wanted." And what does Laban say? "Well, if you also want Rachel, you can have her, but you'll have to work 7 more years." And what does Jacob do? "I'm going to work 7 more years." So Jacob works an additional 7 years for Laban. And at the end of the additional 7 years, he's permitted to take Rachel. This gives him 2 wives, but who's counting? So now Jacob has Leah as a wife, and he has Rachel as a wife. Now, as luck would have it, Rachel has trouble bearing children as well. The Old Testament is full of women who are barren or who don't have children until very late in life. So Rachel, although she's the one that Jacob loves, can't seem to have any children. Leah, on the other hand, the one whom Jacob doesn't love, is having children right and left. And so Leah has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, at least 6 boy children from Jacob and at least 1 daughter. And one of the male children of Leah's is Judah, and Judah is the great-great-great-great-great-great grandfather of Jesus. So Judah is the line of Jesus. Rachel isn't. So why am I including Rachel in the story? I'm including Rachel in the story because as she becomes old, she is also being the gift of children. And she does wind up having 2 children. She has Joseph and she has Benjamin. And these 2 children of Rachel are 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel, which were all fathered by Jacob. The other members of the 12 tribes of Israel, the 6 of them fathered by Jacob and Leah, were Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. So that's 6 children from Leah, 2 children from Rachel, but there's 12 tribes of Israel. Turns out that in the course of his growing up, Jacob also had relations with 2 other ladies. One was called Zilpah and the other was called Bilhah, and they gave 2 more children, Gad and Asher from Zilpah, and Dan and Naphtali from Bilhah. And those, added to the ones before, make up the 12 tribes of Israel. However, Leah is the direct ancestor of Jesus, as is Jacob. Rachel is just qualifies as an aunt, or an aunt, as we say in Virginia. But it's hard to leave Rachel out of the picture. Now let's move several hundred years in time, past the days of Abraham and his family, Isaac, and then Jacob, and move on to the time of King David. King David, as you might remember, was not the first king, but the second king of the Israelites, and their great king. And we heard the story of David and Bathsheba in my earlier talk, and that David and Bathsheba had a child, and their child was Solomon, who became the next king after David. Well, Solomon was also a great king. Plenty of good stories of Solomon about his wisdom. And Solomon built the temple that David could not get built. So the great temple in Jerusalem was the Temple of Solomon, not the Temple of David. And so Solomon ruled wisely while he was still not senile. At some point in Solomon's rule, he kind of went past the point of good common sense. The wise king became kind of the foolish king. And to make a long story short, Solomon, in his later days, acquired something like 700 wives and several hundred more women who he slept with but didn't take on as a wife. And Solomon became a little bit over the top. In the Bible, only one of these women that Solomon took is recorded, and you find it in the first book of Kings, and it's Naamah, Naamah. Naamah, the one wife of Solomon that is recorded in the Bible, and it's recorded because she is the one who gave birth to the child Rehoboam, who became the king that succeeded Solomon. In that action, that makes Naamah a bona fide great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother of Jesus, because Solomon is in the direct line of ancestry of Jesus, and the next one, Rehoboam, is also in the direct line of Jesus. Unfortunately, Rehoboam was not a very good king. When I say he's not a very good king, as recorded in the first book of Kings, he permitted many false gods to be worshipped amongst the Israelites. And he did it so badly The gods that he included were Milcom, Molech, Ammonite gods, Chemosh, Moabite gods. It was so bad that God told Rehoboam that you're going to be punished. As a result of Rehoboam's badness, the kingdom of the Israelites was going to be divided. And so at that point, they reached a split, and there were two kingdoms. There was the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel. And Judah was the kingdom that, well, stemmed from Judah, one of the sons of Leah. And that's the one that we're going to track, because Judah was the kingdom that produced the heirs of Jesus. Israel, a parallel, almost parallel kingdom, but a different piece of land, did not produce the heirs of Jesus, although there was some connection between the two. And in the first and second book of Kings in the Old Testament, both kingdoms get recorded as to who their king was and who their king's wife was, if mentioned, and who the king's heir was. So Rehoboam, thanks to him, Israel split into two kingdoms. So thanks a lot, Rehoboam. And it's all because you left Yahweh in favor of false gods. But your mother was Naamah, and she's the next woman that has more than just a name mentioned in the Old Testament. So much from that. Let's move a few more kings down, actually to the next king after Rehoboam, and we come up with Abijam. And Abijam's mother was a lady named Maacah. Now, the interesting thing about Maacah is, and this is also mentioned in 1 Kings, Maacah is referred to as the daughter of Abishalom, who's also called Uriel, and became the wife of Rehoboam. Now, Rehoboam's child then was Abijam. And Abijam had a child called Asa. And it says that Asa's mother was also Maacah, the daughter of Abishalom. So there's a possibility that this Maacah became the mother of one of the kings of Israel, of Judah, and then took that child and had a child by him who also became a king of Judah. There's something a little bit unclear on this point. Some biblical scholars try to evade this by saying, well, it does say that she's the same woman as the mother of two consecutive kings, but maybe those kings were brothers and not father and son. You could say maybe, but that's not exactly what the Book of Kings said. So it's a little bit unclear what Maacah's relationship was. However, what is clear is that Maacah, after Abijam ruled and Asa was ruling, Maacah was the queen of, was not the queen. She was the queen mother of all the false gods imaginable. Asherah and not Yahweh. She worshiped other gods. And in fact, it was so bad that her own son, or was it her grandson, the king Asa, deposed her, sent her out of the kingdom, because sent her to a Wadi Kadron, they called it, because she was so bad. So she was a bona fide ancestor of Jesus. But as we noted from the first talk, it was important for Jesus to let us understand as Christians that we don't always have good ancestors. It's possible that maybe I've got an ancestor way back when who was an axe murderer, for all I know. Maybe you do too. But your ancestor doesn't make you a person. This bad ancestor of Jesus, this Makkah, doesn't mean that Jesus was a bad person. Hardly. Jesus was a very good person. Okay, so let's move along about another 50 years or so and get to, we're still in the kingdom of Judah. The two kingdoms eventually will merge together into one, but not yet. This was around 853 BC, and we're in the reign of King Joram, also called Jehoram, a king of Judah. And his wife was named Athaliah, or Athaliah, but I think it's Athaliah. Got a lot to say about this Athaliah. In addition to being the wife of King Joram. She came from the other kingdom, Israel's kingdom. She was the daughter of one of the kings of Israel, not of Judah. Her father was called Ahab. Again, sounds a little bit like Moby Dick. Remember a while back I said Moby Dick started off by saying, "Call me Ishmael." Well, remember the captain of the ship in Moby Dick was Ahab? Well, it turns out that Athaliah was the daughter of King Ahab, who was a king of Israel. And her mother was even more famous. Her mother was the famous Jezebel. So Athaliah, the daughter of King Ahab and the notorious Jezebel, became the wife of King Joram. Now, at Joram's death, Athaliah really showed her colors, as we might say. Athaliah killed all of Joram's children. Only one survived accidentally, and she would have killed him, but she thought she did. Athaliah did this so that she could succeed to the throne of Judah, which she did. She forcibly took over the, quote, throne of Judah, becoming the first and only queen of Judah. And she got there by murdering all of her children, with the exception of one. And that was a mistake that she missed that one. What kind of a queen was she? She was one of the most hated people in all of Judah ever. She promoted the cult of the Phoenician god Baal. She was a terrible queen. She was so bad that at some point a coup was organized and she was dragged out of the temple the king, and killed. And her son, who was an infant at the time that she murdered the others, named Joash, was then installed by the people as king. So the only woman king to ever rule in either of the two kingdoms, and one of the worst rulers they ever had. Sorry about that. But got Jezebel into the story. So that was the seventh woman that Matthew didn't mention, but that we had a story for. And that's basically the end of what I've got. The other people who are named in typically the first or second book of Kings, either as wives or as wives of some of the other kings of Judah, include Jecoliah, Jerusha, Hephzibah, Jedidah, and but regrettably I have no stories for them. So that's it. And I think the message that we take from this, as we took the message from the earlier story about Matthew and the ancestors of Jesus that he did mention, there were some good people and there were some bad people. We come from our ancestors, but we don't have to be like our ancestors. We would like to say that we inherit their good things, but if we did that, we might say we also inherit their bad things. But we are our own people. And I think that was the message that Matthew was trying to stay before. And I think if he had included these, that would have been his message for now. So have a good day, and thank you for joining.